Silence is not weakness. This 10-year-old boy proved it. Dan, a shy and quiet 10-year-old, was often bullied on the schoolyard by Ryan and his group of classmates. They snatched his things, pushed him down, and made him the laughingstock during a school talent show. But instead of staying silent, Dan quietly practiced the martial arts his mother had once taught him, determined not to let himself be hurt again. One day, when Ryan's group taunted him after school, Dan stood up, not with anger, but with calm skill and self-control. He defeated Ryan in a fair confrontation, leaving the group stunned and ending the bullying. No one dared to underestimate Dan anymore, and he regained respect, not through violence, but through courage. The schoolyard was filled with fine dust swirling in the fading afternoon light, streaks of golden orange stretching across the dry ground. In the middle of that space lay a boy sprawled out, Dan, his sleeve torn slightly, dust clinging to his faded jeans. His backpack had fallen to one side, the zipper undone, a few notebooks poking out. Around him, 4 other boys stood in a circle, their sharp laughter cutting through the still air like a blade. The tallest one, pretending to kick the air near the fallen boy, turned to his friends with a smug grin. Look at him, down like a puppy and too scared to bark. The others burst into laughter, some clapping as if they'd just watched a circus act. Dan didn't respond from the ground. He slowly pushed himself up, his small, trembling hands brushing dust off his shirt, then quietly bent to pick up his backpack. His eyes, hidden behind messy black hair, didn't meet the mocking gazes. He stood straight, shoulders slightly hunched as if carrying an invisible weight, and turned to walk away. His figure grew smaller down the path to the school gate, the laughter behind him still echoing. His eyes held neither anger nor fear, just endurance, deep and familiar as if he'd grown used to this scene. If it were you, what would you do? Would you teach your child to be patient, to endure to avoid trouble? Or would you tell them to stand up, just once, to prove they're not a loser? Dan wasn't a standout kid. Thin and small-shouldered, he seemed weighed down by his own shyness, his black hair always covering part of his pale face. New to the school for less than a semester, he was nearly invisible among the noisy crowd of students. In class, he sat in the back corner by the window, gazing at the green treetops and doodling in a small notebook. He rarely spoke, so much so that his teacher once asked, "Dan, do you want to share anything with the class?" He shook his head, eyes down, hands gripping his pencil as if afraid someone might take it. But in that silence, no one knew Dan carried a deep inner world where he drew dragons soaring and read thick books about quiet heroes. Dan's mother was the only one who understood him. A former karate instructor with strong hands and piercing eyes, she'd taught him the basics when he was younger. How to stand firm, breathe evenly, and throw a punch without letting emotions take over. "Real strength isn't in your fists," she'd said, her voice warm yet firm. "It's in knowing when not to use them." Dan never forgot those words, but he hadn't used what she taught him, not because he'd forgotten, but because he was afraid. Afraid that if he fought back, he'd become someone else, someone like his father, who was in prison for hurting someone in a drunken rage. Every time he thought of his dad, Dan told himself, "I don't want to be like him. I don't want to hurt anyone." That inner mantra repeated like a curse, making him choose silence over resistance. But not everyone left Dan alone. Ryan, an 11-year-old with slick blonde hair and a towering frame, ruled the schoolyard. From a well-off family with influential parents, he acted like he owned the place. He never went solo. His 3 loyal friends, a pack of troublemakers, followed his every command. To them, Dan was the perfect target, small, timid, and never fighting back. They'd corner him after school, snatch his shoes and toss them over the fence, or hide his backpack in the trash. "Silent clown," Ryan once sneered, patting Dan's shoulder as if pitying him. "Were you born to entertain me?" His crew laughed along, their cackles echoing across the yard as Dan stood there, hands clutching his backpack straps, eyes fixed on the ground as if wishing it would swallow him whole. At home, when Dan returned with a torn shirt or muddy shoes, his mother didn't pry. She'd sit beside him quietly, place a hand on his shoulder, and say, "I know you're stronger than this, Dan. But I also know you don't want to be like your father." Her voice was gentle but carried a subtle push. "If you stay silent forever, people will think you're weak. I don't want you to fight, but I want you to protect yourself in your own way." Dan nodded faintly, saying nothing, but inside, a small wave began to rise. He wondered, can I do it? Can I stand up without becoming someone I hate? That question haunted him, following him to sleep and weaving into the sketches on his pages. Like a seed quietly sprouting, that thought grew in Dan's different kind of silence, not surrender, but preparation for something greater. Days later, the schoolyard remained Dan's private battlefield, inescapable from mocking stares and cruel pranks. At lunch, when the recess bell rang, he'd hide under an old oak tree with the meal his mother packed. But Ryan and his crew wouldn't let him be. One day, as Dan opened his lunchbox, white rice and shredded chicken his mother had carefully made that morning, Ryan swooped in, snatched it, and dumped it on the ground. Rice scattered across the grass, some sticking to Dan's worn white shoes. "Oops. Sorry, silent clown." Ryan laughed, feigning regret. "You're used to eating off the dirt, right?" His friends roared, one stomping the remaining rice as if erasing Dan's tiny joy for the day. Dan said nothing. He knelt, trembling hands gathering the spilled rice, cradling it like it was the last precious thing he had. "Mom woke up early for this," he told himself, his inner voice small but clear. "I can't let it go to waste." But as he looked up, Ryan grabbed the milk from his bag, popped it open, and poured it over Dan's head. The white liquid dripped down his hair, soaking his shirt, while the group's laughter rang out like a chorus of malice. "Now he's a real clown," one shouted, pointing as Ryan clapped in delight. Dan stood there, milk dripping from his chin, his eyes blurred. Whether from the milk or held back tears, it wasn't clear. But the peak of his humiliation wasn't on the schoolyard, it was at the weekend talent show. Dan had prepared for a month to recite a poem he'd written about small birds braving storms. He'd practiced in front of the mirror every night, perfecting each word so his voice wouldn't shake. On the day, the auditorium was packed, applause ringing as students performed. When Dan's turn came, he wore a crisp white shirt his mother had ironed, holding his poem, stepping out with shaky legs. He took a deep breath, about to speak, when Ryan bolted from the front row, snatched the mic, and yelled, "Is this the mute's lullaby? Let's see if he can talk." The room erupted in laughter, piercing Dan's pride like needles. He froze, the paper crumpling in his grip, his vision blurring as he faced the pointing crowd. Ryan fake yawned, patting Dan's shoulder. "Go home, stop embarrassing yourself." Dan said nothing, just turned and left the stage, the laughter chasing him like a relentless ghost. That night, his mother waited at the door. She didn't ask why his eyes were red or his shirt wrinkled. She pulled him to the couch, placed a hand on his shoulder, and looked into his eyes. "I saw everything, Dan," her voice low, gentle yet firm. "I know it hurts. But you have the right to protect yourself. No one gets to make you small." Dan looked down, hands clasped, and whispered, "But if I fight back, I'll be like Dad, Mom." "I don't want that." She smiled sadly, brushing his hair. "You don't have to fight to win, Dan. I taught you karate not to hurt others, but to know your own strength. Use it when you need to, not out of anger, but for yourself." That night, as pale moonlight streamed through his window, Dan got up and spread an old mat on the floor. He began practicing the karate moves his mother had taught him: punches, stances, breaths. Years had passed since he'd touched them, but his body remembered, like an instinct reawakened. I don't want to be weak anymore, he told himself, his inner voice clearer than ever. I won't let them laugh in my face again. Sweat beaded on his forehead, his small hands clenched into fists, not from hate, but from a quiet resolve growing in his chest. Silence was no longer an option. Now, Dan was preparing to change everything in his own way. Ash Part 4. Climax. Standing up, not striking back. The late afternoon sun painted the basketball court behind the school red, long shadows of trees swaying on cracked concrete. The dismissal bell had rung long ago, and most students had left, leaving a stifling silence broken only by the wind whistling through dry leaves. Dan walked slowly across the court, backpack slung over one shoulder, shoes dusty as usual. He meant to head home early, but today he wouldn't get the chance. From a distance, familiar laughter rang out, sharp and threatening. Ryan and his three friends emerged from a shadowed corner near the fence, their steps bold like predators scenting weak prey. Look who's here, Ryan drawled, voice thick with arrogance, hands in his pockets. The silent clown trying to sneak home? We're not done having fun yet. Dan stopped, hands tightening on his straps, but his eyes didn't drop like before. He stood still, quietly watching the group approach. Ryan smirked, signaling a curly-haired kid with glasses to grab Dan's backpack. But this time, Dan didn't let it happen. He sidestepped swiftly, like a shadow, making the kid stumble and nearly fall. The others froze for a moment. Then Ryan laughed louder, as if Dan's resistance only spiced up the game. Oh, you can move now. Ryan stepped forward, shoving Dan's shoulder hard. Let's see what you've got. The push forced Dan back a few steps, but he didn't fall. He stood firm, knees slightly bent in the karate stance he'd practiced nightly. Ryan didn't notice, too cocky, too used to Dan being the victim. Who do you think you are? Ryan snarled, lunging to grab Dan's collar, but Dan moved. He dodged Ryan's swing then, in a flash, locked Ryan's wrist with his right hand and pushed his elbow with his left. In an instant, Ryan lost balance and crashed to the ground with a heavy thud. Dust billowed around him, his face red with pain and shock. Ryan's crew stood stunned, mouths agape, unable to believe their eyes. The glasses kid stammered. What did you just do? Dan didn't answer right away. He stood tall, hands relaxed, eyes coolly fixed on Ryan as he scrambled up. Ryan panted, clutching his sore wrist, his face twisted with shame and fury. You dare hit me? He roared, charging again. But Dan sidestepped calmly, using a gentle throw to send Ryan sprawling once more. This time, Dan held him down with one hand on his shoulder, not harshly, not aggressively, just enough to keep him there. I don't need to shout for you to get it, Dan said, his voice soft but clear, speaking to them directly for the first time. That's enough. The air grew heavy, like a stone pressing on their chests. Ryan's friends backed off, eyes darting between Dan and their fallen leader in confusion. Ryan gasped, glaring up at Dan with bloodshot eyes, but he didn't move again. Silence fell, broken only by the wind and the ragged breaths of the onlookers. From afar, a few passing students stopped, whispering and pointing at Dan. One murmured, "No way. Dan actually did it?" The buzz spread like a spark catching on dry grass. Dan let go, stood up straight, and kept his gaze on Ryan. He didn't smile or gloat, just picked up his backpack and turned away. But inside, a voice rang out, stronger than ever. I don't have to be afraid anymore. I'm not like Dad. I'm better than that. His figure faded beyond the fence, leaving Ryan slumped on the ground, clutching his shoulder, face contorted in defeat. His friends didn't approach, just stood there, eyes blank as if they'd lost something they once thought untouchable. The climax had come, not with fists or yells, but with the cold self-control Dan had quietly forged, a response not for revenge, but to prove he was no longer weak. In the days after the basketball court showdown, the school's atmosphere shifted subtly, like ripples spreading in silence. The yard stayed noisy with kids laughing at recess, but one small corner had changed. Dan was no longer the shadow hiding under the oak tree. He still spoke little, still sat alone with his sketchbook and pencil, but now no one dared cross the invisible line he'd drawn. Ryan and his crew steered clear. Whenever they passed Dan in the halls or yard, Ryan looked away, eyes avoiding him, as if just seeing Dan brought back the day he'd been thrown down in front of his friends. The rest of the group drifted apart, no longer clustering like before, their old arrogance dissolving like smoke in the wind. Dan didn't turn cocky after that. He remained the skinny kid with messy black hair, still drawing dragons and reading thick books in the library. But something had shifted, not in his words or actions, but in how he held his head. His small shoulders no longer slumped under an unseen burden. His eyes didn't dodge when someone looked at him. One afternoon, as he read poetry in the library, not to a crowd, but to himself, a few curious kids approached. "That poem from the talent show, you really wrote it?" a short-haired girl asked hesitantly. Dan nodded, then surprised himself by reading aloud. "A small bird doesn't need to shout, just wings strong enough to outfly the storm." She smiled, sat beside him, and for the first time, Dan felt he wasn't alone. At home, his mother noticed the change. She didn't ask much, just watched quietly each night as Dan kept practicing karate on the mat. Once, she stood at his door, seeing him punch the air with steady breaths, and whispered, "I knew you could do it, Dan. Not with violence, but with yourself." Dan turned, giving a rare smile, the first she'd seen in months. "I didn't want to let you down," he said, voice quiet but sure, "or myself anymore." At the semester's end, the homeroom teacher surprised everyone by mentioning Dan in her speech. The auditorium was full, applause loud as students were praised, but when she spoke, all eyes turned to the boy in the back row. "Some lessons aren't in books," her warm voice carried through the mic, "but in courage. I've seen a student here stand up, not to fight, but to defend himself. He taught us that silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it's the greatest strength." Dan bowed his head, ears red with embarrassment, but his lips curved slightly, a subtle smile only his mother, in the parents section, caught. From then on, Dan stayed quiet, but no one called him Silent Clown again. Ryan never apologized, but he never bullied anyone either. The shadow of that defeat loomed too large. Dan didn't need their approval. What he reclaimed was respect from others and, more importantly, himself. Inside, a mantra repeated as he crossed the schoolyard. "I don't need to shout to prove anything. I did it, and that's enough." He kept reading poetry in the library, kept drawing dragons, and for the first time, he felt he belonged, not through loud words, but through the quiet grit he'd forged in his darkest days. As time passed, the schoolyard buzzed with laughter, but Dan's story became a quiet reminder among the students. The skinny kid once shoved down and mocked before the whole school was now a symbol of something unexpected. Silence wasn't surrender. It could be the strongest weapon when wielded right. Dan didn't change the world or become a grand hero in everyone's eyes. He stayed himself, quiet, introspective, with his sketchbook and half-written poems, but he changed how others saw him, and more crucially, how he saw himself. From a boy afraid of becoming violent like his father, Dan learned real strength lay not in fists or shouts, but in self-control, patience, and standing up when it mattered. That lesson wasn't just for him. It was a silent message that spread. Anyone can find strength within, even if they choose not to speak. What do you think? Did Dan do the right thing? Have you ever seen a kid stand up in a way that even adults would admire? If you believe courage doesn't need to shout, like this video. Comment with a moment you've seen a child stand up for what's right. And subscribe to Proud Stories for more comeback tales full of humanity and depth, even when the hero's just 10 years old.